For almost 6 years, I clung to the belief that if I showed up early, stayed late, and cleaned up every mess no one else dared to touch, someone would eventually realize I wasn't just a fixture bolted to a cubicle. That the company would look up from their glossy reports and see that I was the one holding the whole thing together. I'm Lucas Hale, 34. And until 3 weeks ago, I was an operations manager at a consulting firm on the south side of Denver. It was the kind of place that handed out cheap bagels to celebrate big quarters while expecting you to give them your nights and weekends for free. I never minded working behind the scenes. I'm not the guy schmoozing clients at steakhouse dinners or throwing around jargon. I was the one catching accounting errors at 11 p.m., the one who stayed sober at the holiday party so everyone else could Uber home drunk, the one who called a panicked client back on Christmas Eve because no one else would pick up. And for a long time, I thought that would be enough. That the quiet, steady work spoke for itself. But in that office, silence wasn't respected. It was exploited. It started gradually, other people collecting bonuses off the back of my projects. My manager Julian taking credit for entire client turnarounds I had let alone. The junior associate I trained getting promoted because she could talk a good game, even though she still didn't know how to export a PDF without help. I told myself it was office politics, that if I kept my head down, the right people would notice. I told myself it wasn't personal, but it was. The breaking point came on a Thursday morning. The monthly performance tracker hit my inbox. It was covered in the same smug pastel color coding HR loved. Revenue was up 18%. Hanover, my account, was the biggest moneymaker in the region. 8 names were listed under discretionary bonuses. Mine wasn't there. I read the file 3 times, searching for any mention, some footnote, a line in the appendix. There was nothing. Just a silent declaration. You don't matter enough to name. I sat there for a long moment, feeling something harden in my chest. It wasn't about the money anymore. It was about what that omission said about how they saw me, how they always had. So I did the thing I should have done years earlier. I booked 15 minutes with Julian and CC Lauren, our VP of Operations. No grand speech, just a conversation. I put on my charcoal blazer, the one I saved for interviews. I brought a folder of performance reports and client testimonials, everything they liked to pretend didn't exist. When they came in, I looked them both in the eye. I'd like to revisit my compensation, I said calmly. Given the scope of what I've managed in the last year, I believe it's overdue. Julian shifted in his seat. Lauren offered me a brittle smile. Then she laughed. Just a small, polite laugh, as if I'd asked for a helicopter. Let's be realistic, she said, her voice sweet as poison. That sentence landed like a slap. I felt something quiet snap inside me. The last thin thread holding me to the idea that fairness existed there. I stood up. I think they expected me to argue or beg, to fill the silence with apologies. I didn't. I straightened my blazer, picked up my folder, and said, "Thank you for your time." Then I walked out. Not just out of the meeting, out of the building, out of the job. No notice, no plan, just one clean, irrevocable choice. When I stepped outside, the air hit me like a slap, cold, bright, undeniable. My phone was already buzzing in my pocket, but I didn't look. I walked past the line of identical black SUVs idling at the curb and just kept going, like I'd been training my whole life for this one exit I never thought I'd take. I made it 2 blocks before the numbness gave way to something worse, doubt. What if I'd overreacted? What if I just torched my career because my pride got bruised? What if I really was replaceable? But even in that moment, a part of me knew better. I wasn't some fragile kid having a tantrum. I was a man who'd finally stopped accepting crumbs from people who'd never once thanked me for the meals I cooked. I got home and stood in the doorway for a long time, still wearing my blazer, as if I'd forgotten how to be someone outside that building. The silence felt massive, like the walls were judging me. But eventually, it started to feel like relief. I poured a glass of water and sat at the kitchen table. For the first time in years, nobody needed me. Nobody was waiting for me to fix a broken spreadsheet or rewrite a proposal at midnight. The only thing that needed my attention was my own life, and I had no idea where to start. Around 8 p.m., the panic crept in. The what-ifs started circling like vultures. What if nobody ever hired me again? What if I just handed Julian a perfect reason to paint me as unstable? What if I'd wasted 6 years proving I was useful to people who saw me as furniture? I gripped the edge of the table and tried to breathe, but it felt like trying to meditate in a burning building. That's when I thought of Helena Davenport. She was the client I'd saved more times than I could count. The reason Hanover had stayed with the firm through 3 leadership changes and a pandemic. We'd spent countless nights on the phone fixing problems her board didn't even know existed. If anyone could understand why I walked away, it was her. I pulled out my phone and stared at her contact photo, a headshot she'd sent me years ago, so I'd remember who you're doing all this for. My thumb hovered over the call button. My stomach twisted. I felt 12 again, like I was about to call home after screwing up so badly I couldn't cover it up. I pressed the button anyway. She answered on the second ring. Her voice was warm, steady. "Lucas," she said. "I was wondering when you'd call." I blinked. "You were." "Of course." She paused. "I heard." I didn't ask how. People like Helena heard everything before it was official. "I wanted you to know," I said, my voice raw, "that it wasn't planned. I couldn't do it anymore." There was a silence that felt less like judgment and more like respect. Then she spoke, her tone low and certain. "I've been waiting for you to realize you were too good for them," she said. "I knew it would happen eventually." I swallowed hard. "I don't even know what comes next." "You will," she replied. "And when you figure it out, you'd better call me first." The tightness in my chest loosened a little. "I'm not asking for anything." "I know," she said gently. "But if you build something, anything, I want to be there." For the first time all day, I smiled. A small, startled thing that felt like hope. After we hung up, I sat there staring at the wall. Then I did something I hadn't done in years. I opened a blank notebook. The cover was stiff, the pages crisp. I wrote one sentence at the top. What if I don't need their permission? I didn't know it then, but that line was the start of everything. It was the first moment I let myself imagine a life where I didn't have to beg to be seen. My phone kept buzzing emails, Slack notifications, missed calls, but I didn't answer any of them. Not that night. Not while the idea was still new and fragile. By the time I finally set the notebook aside, the fear was still there, but something else was growing alongside it, something I hadn't felt in a long time. Freedom. The next morning, I woke before dawn, same as always. My body didn't yet understand it wasn't tethered to someone else's clock. I lay there staring at the ceiling, feeling the familiar pressure to check my email, to brace for some crisis that needed fixing. But there was no crisis anymore. Not mine, anyway. I made coffee and sat with my notebook open on the kitchen table. My mind kept drifting back to Helena's voice. If you build something, I want to be there. For years, I'd been the person propping up other people's reputations, smoothing over their failures, never daring to claim anything as my own. Now, for the first time, I wondered what would happen if I did. I started making a list. Not a business plan, just all the things I knew how to do. Client rescue, executive communications, project recovery, all the invisible work I'd been praised for privately and ignored for publicly. By the time the sun crept over the rooftops outside my window, I had 4 full pages of bullet points. It felt surreal, seeing it laid out in ink. Proof that I wasn't just a replaceable piece of machinery, that I had built something real. My phone buzzed, and I finally allowed myself to look. The notifications were a patchwork of concern and condescension. Julian, no hard feelings. Let's connect soon. Happy to be a reference if you need one. Lauren, surprised by your decision. If you'd like to talk transition logistics, let us know. A couple of junior analysts had sent short, nervous messages. Heard you left. Hope you're okay. None of them asked why. They already knew. They just didn't want to say it out loud. That afternoon, Helena texted, "I have time tomorrow morning if you want to talk specifics." Specifics. Not sympathy. Not pity. Opportunity. I wrote back, 9 a.m. My place. When I put the phone down, a quiet determination settled over me. It felt nothing like rage or panic. It was calmer than that, more dangerous. Like standing in the eye of a storm you'd spent years pretending wasn't coming. I spent the rest of the day pulling together everything I could find, case studies, templates, timelines. By the time I was done, I had the rough bones of something that looked almost like a company. That night, I couldn't sleep. My brain kept replaying the same memory, Julian smirking across the table as Lauren laughed and said, "Let's be realistic." How many times had I mistaken their amusement for authority? How many times had I confused their approval for proof that I was worth something? I got out of bed around 2 a.m. and opened the folder again. The documents looked so simple, just words and numbers on paper, but they were mine, and that was enough to steady me. At 8:57 the next morning, Helena knocked on my door. She was carrying a cardboard tray with 2 lattes. When I opened the door, she didn't waste time on small talk. She handed me a cup and walked straight to the kitchen table, studying the spread of papers. "Show me," she said. So I did. I walked her through my notes. I didn't pitch it with flair, just the facts. The way I'd always spoken in meetings, calm, precise, before someone louder repeated my points and got credit. Helena didn't interrupt. She didn't nod politely while scrolling her phone. She listened. When I finished, she sat back and tapped her nails against her cup, studying me like she was weighing something important. You realize, she said finally, they're going to spin this, right? I shrugged. They already have. She tilted her head. Any threats yet? No, I said. Just polite emails pretending they care. Her mouth curved into a humorless smile. They're afraid. I hesitated. Of what? Of what it looks like when the person who held it all together stops pretending. Her words landed heavier than I expected. For so long, I'd assumed I was disposable, that if I ever left, nobody would notice. But she was right. They didn't just lose an employee. They lost the gravity that kept the whole mess from spinning apart. Helena finished her coffee and stood. When you're ready, send me your proposal, she said. I want to move quickly. I nodded. You'll have it by tomorrow. As she left, I felt something shift. A realization I couldn't unsee. I'd never been powerless. I'd just been trained to believe I was. And now that I'd stopped believing it, there was no going back. I spent the rest of that day fine-tuning my proposal. Every sentence felt like reclaiming something they'd chipped away. My credibility, my autonomy, my right to expect respect instead of scraps. At 11:30 p.m., I hit send. The file sailed off to Helena's inbox with a quiet finality that made me exhale. For the first time in years, I wasn't waiting for Julian's sign-off or Lauren's approval. I woke early the next morning to her reply. Let's do this. 3 words, but they read like a door swinging open. By noon, my phone lit up again. A new number. I almost ignored it, assuming it was another recruiter trying to sell me on a lateral move. But curiosity got the better of me. Lucas Hale speaking. There was a pause. Then a voice I knew too well, forced into a strained calm. Lucas, it's Julian. Do you have a minute? I almost laughed. For years, he'd sent me one-line emails, never a phone call unless there was a fire he needed me to put out. What can I do for you? I think we need to clear the air, he said. Things have escalated quickly. I glanced at my kitchen table, where a signed contract from Helena's board sat waiting for my counter-signature. Have they? I said lightly. He cleared his throat. Look, you've made your point. But walking out the way you did? That's not how professionals handle disagreements. I felt a slow burn in my chest. No, Julian. Professionals don't sit across the table, laugh in someone's face, and tell them to be realistic. His voice tightened. You know we appreciated your work. You've always been a valued part of the team. You valued that I didn't ask for anything. I corrected. The minute I did, you treated it like a punchline. Silence. I imagined him in his glass office, the same spot where he'd once told me I was too indispensable to promote. I wondered how it felt to realize the person you dismiss could walk away and take the trust with them. Finally, he sighed. Be reasonable, Lucas. You didn't give notice. You're already putting accounts at risk. This could get messy for you. I leaned back in my chair, marveling at how predictable it was. First, they minimize you. Then they threaten you. You can call it messy, I said. I call it consequences. Come on, he said, voice softer now. We don't have to be enemies. We were never friends, I replied. And you don't get to define what I am to you anymore. Before he could answer, I hung up. The moment I set my phone down, my hands started shaking. Not from fear, just the adrenaline of saying everything I'd held back for years. An hour later, Lauren sent a carefully worded email. We'd like to arrange an exit interview. Please confirm your availability. I didn't reply. That afternoon, I drove past the old building. The parking lot was full, just like any weekday. For a second, I wondered if someone was sitting at my old desk, fielding the same panicked calls I used to. But I knew the truth. Nobody there knew how to keep Hanover stable. When I got home, I made myself a sandwich and sat down to review the contract. My name was there, in crisp black letters. No one above me to countersign, no middle manager to edit my language. I thought I'd feel triumphant. Instead, I just felt clear, like I'd finally stepped out of a fog. That night, I received a text from Helena. We've pulled the account. Effective immediately. I'll let you handle the announcement. I read it twice. My heartbeat didn't spike. My breath didn't catch. It just felt right. They had spent years pretending I was disposable. But the moment I left, the myth collapsed. I wasn't just a name in their system. I was the anchor they mistook for background noise. And now they would have to figure out how to survive without me. The next morning, I was halfway through my second cup of coffee when the knock came. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity won out, and I opened the door to find Julian standing there in a corporate-branded jacket, phone clutched in his hand like a security blanket. "Lucas," he said, voice carefully neutral. "Mind if I come in?" I didn't move. For a moment, we just stared at each other. He looked smaller without the office around him. Smaller still when his eyes landed on the stack of documents spread across my kitchen table. He took that as an invitation and stepped inside anyway. I let the door fall shut behind him. He perched on the edge of the armchair like a man who knew he'd already lost but hadn't decided how to admit it. "I'm going to be straight with you," he began. "This situation is escalating in a way that doesn't help anyone." I raised an eyebrow. "Escalating? You know what I mean. You left with no notice. You're working with Helena. That's a conflict." I leaned against the wall, arms folded. "It's not a conflict if she chose to leave." His jaw clenched. "You're burning bridges, Lucas. You know that, right?" "No," I said calmly. "I'm building something. There's a difference." He laughed once, brittle. "You think you can just start over?" "With one client. One client who trusts me more than she ever trusted you," I replied. He blinked, caught off guard by the bluntness. I didn't soften it. I'd spent enough years softening the truth for people who didn't deserve it. "Look," he said, shifting tactics, "I'm not here to fight. We both know you did good work. Maybe we underestimated you." I tilted my head. "You think?" His mouth tightened. "But you're making a mistake. You think independence feels good now. Wait until you realize how quickly people move on. The industry forgets you if you don't have a company name behind you." I studied him for a moment. For all his polished confidence, he sounded tired. Afraid. Because he knew what I knew. If Helena's departure got around, other clients would start wondering who actually kept the lights on. "You know," I said slowly, "the only reason any of those clients ever stayed was because I never lied to them. I didn't overpromise. I didn't vanish when something went wrong. That's what they remember." "That's not enough," he shot back. "Trust doesn't scale." "No," I agreed. "It doesn't. That's why you can't fake it." He looked away. For a second, he seemed older than I'd ever seen him. Like the truth was a weight he wasn't built to carry. Finally, he stood. "If you change your mind, let me know. There's still a place for you." "There never was," I said, softer than I meant to. That was the problem. He hesitated by the door. "You'll regret this." I already regret staying as long as I did. When he left, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt clean. Like I'd finally scraped off something that had been stuck to me so long I'd stopped noticing it. The rest of the day passed in a quiet, focused haze. I sent Helena the final version of our onboarding plan. I filed the incorporation papers for my new firm, an LLC with a name I'd picked at 3 a.m. because it sounded like possibility. And when dusk fell, I sat by the window watching the city lights blink on, feeling something I hadn't in years. Peace. Not because everything was solved. Not because I knew what came next. Because for once, I was the only person I needed permission from. 2 days later, my official launch email went out to the short list of contacts I trusted not to forward it to Julian. No big announcement. No LinkedIn post. Just a simple note. "I've started something new. If you need a hand, you know where to find me." By noon, the replies started to trickle in. "About time you did this. I have a project that's perfect for you. Let's set up a call." Each message felt like a small vindication. Proof that all those years of quietly showing up had actually mattered to the people who counted. That night, I drove past the old office one last time. The lights were still on in the corner suite. For a moment, I imagined Julian pacing behind the glass, trying to explain to the partners why the Hanover account and the others threatening to follow were suddenly out of reach. I didn't feel anger, not even satisfaction, just distance, like watching a place I'd once lived in another lifetime. Back home, I poured a drink and finally allowed myself to scroll through the last batch of unread messages. One was from a junior analyst I'd mentored. She'd written, "I heard what they said about you after you left. None of it's true. You were the reason I stayed as long as I did." That hit harder than I expected. Because for years, I'd assumed nobody saw me, that I'd been invisible by default. But I was only invisible to the people who preferred it that way. The next morning, my first client call started right at 9 o'clock. Helena's voice was brisk, all business. "Lucas, I've looped in our CFO. She's reviewed your proposal, and we're ready to start." I smiled, though she couldn't see it. "Great. I'll walk you through our timeline." For the next hour, I laid out every step of the transition. Nobody interrupted. Nobody questioned whether I was qualified to lead. When I finished, there was a beat of quiet. Then Helena said, "I trust you. Let's move." When the call ended, I sat back, letting the stillness settle around me. It didn't feel empty this time. It felt earned. That afternoon, an email from HR at my old company arrived. A clinical note about exit documentation. I read it once, closed it, and never opened it again. There was nothing left to finalize. I spent the next week setting up a system I'd never been allowed to build, one where nobody had to apologize for needing a day off, where nobody's work disappeared behind a louder person's name. A system that respected people's time as much as their output. By Friday, I'd signed 2 more contracts. Small projects, but enough to prove this wasn't a fluke. Enough to pay my rent without any help from people who thought I was lucky just to have a seat at their table. Late one evening, I cleaned out the last remnants of that old life. The ID badge, the branded mug, the stack of notebooks filled with other people's demands. I took them down to the dumpster and didn't look back when I let them go. When I got home, the kitchen was quiet. No Slack notifications. No urgent pings. Just me, and the slow realization that all the things they said I couldn't do had never been true. They weren't facts. They were projections, limits they needed me to believe in so I wouldn't try to surpass them. And now that I'd left, the story was mine to finish. I picked up my notebook and wrote 3 words across the top of a fresh page. This is mine. If you'd told me a year ago that I'd walk away without a backup plan, I would have called you insane. But standing there, watching the last trace of that company fade from my life, I finally understood. I'd never been asking for a raise. I'd been asking to be seen, and I wasn't going to beg for that ever again.